You know, we often think of the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act as this great moral victory for Britain, right?
The moment the empire chose virtue over profit.
Exactly. But when you actually dig into the sources like we have for this deep dive, that whole shiny narrative it falls apart pretty quickly.
It really does.
This isn't just a story about the end of slavery. It's a story of compromise, of delayed freedom, and a staggering financial payoff given to all the wrong people.
That's it. It's
Yeah.
the moment the system legally ended, but the infrastructure of oppression was, financially cemented for the oppressors.
Wow.
So our mission today is really to take a focused deep dive into the forces that led to the act, the moral side, the economic side, and, critically, the role of violent resistance.
And we have to examine its two most, let's say, controversial parts.
The apprenticeship system and that massive compensation package.
And when you put those two together, you see the injustice so clearly.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have this apprenticeship system, which was basically just a way to keep unpaid labor going. And on the other, you have 20 million pounds going to the slave owners and absolutely nothing for the people who'd actually built all that wealth. Zero.
Not a penny. And that's why this is so important. This is the moment legal abolition was secured. But the fight for any kind of real economic freedom, well, it was only just beginning.
So let's start with the law itself, the Slavery Abolition Act. It's passed on August 28th, 1833.
Okay.
And on paper, it seems final. Slavery is over in most of the British Empire. A huge political achievement.
But the catch, and it's a huge one, is that freedom wasn't immediate at all.
Not immediate. What does that even mean in this context?
It meant Parliament put in something called the apprenticeship system.
Right. And this sounds so bureaucratic, but the reality was just brutal.
It was. It meant that the formerly enslaved people had to keep working for their former masters, unpaid, for a transitional period.
This wasn't job training.
No, not at all. It was forced labor under a new name. The planters argued they needed time to adjust, and they also made this very patronizing argument that the enslaved needed to be taught how to be free.
So how long did this last?
The act set it up so domestic workers were apprentices until 1838, but the field laborers, the bulk of the workforce, were trapped until 1840.
So 7 years after the so-called abolition of slavery.
7 years. And the control was still there. The local magistrates, who were usually in the pockets of the planters, could still order punishments like whippings if you didn't meet your work quotas.
It really is just slavery like codified into law.
It absolutely is. And this brings us to the financial side of the deal, which is, frankly, unbelievable.
The 20 million pounds.
20 million pounds.
Yeah.
Paid by the British taxpayer to the planters for the loss of their property. And that property was human beings.
It's a number we hear a lot, but the scale of it is just, it's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. Historians have calculated that sum was nearly 40% of the UK's entire national budget at the time.
20%.
Yeah. I mean, just try to imagine that today. Almost half the national budget, for one thing. And it wasn't for education or infrastructure for the newly freed people. It was reparations for the oppressors.
It's the ultimate historical irony. The people who owned other human beings get this massive wealth transfer from the state.
While the people who suffered for generations got nothing. No compensation for their labor, their pain, their stolen lives, no land, no capital, no resources to start again.
So this was a deeply, deeply compromised deal. It wasn't a moral triumph. It was an economic transaction.
A transaction where the victims were left with nothing and then forced into several more years of unpaid work.
Okay, so if the government was so willing to make these huge compromises, why pass the act at all? Because our sources are clear. Moral arguments alone were not enough to beat the West India lobby.
That's the key question. It wasn't one thing. It was a convergence of three powerful forces that just became too much to ignore.
Okay, so let's break those down. What was the first front?
The first was moral and religious conviction. This was the movement's heart. You had Christian abolitionists, especially groups like the Baptists, the Methodists.
The nonconformists.
Exactly. And they were preaching from pulpits all across Britain that slavery was a sin. They turned it from a political debate into a crisis of national conscience.
And you see that in the Caribbean, too, with missionaries like James Philippo in Jamaica. They weren't just preaching. They were actively helping to set up free villages.
Right, creating a real economic alternative to the plantation, a place where you could own your own land. That was radical.
So that's the moral fire. What was the second force?
Political leadership. This was a long, grinding fight in Parliament. You have to start with William Wilberforce, of course. His big win was ending the slave trade in 1807.
And then Thomas Fowell Buxton picks up the baton and gets the 1833 Act over the line.
Exactly. And their work was amplified by these incredibly powerful personal stories. Olada Equiano's autobiography, it exposed the sheer horror of it all to the British public. It made it impossible to look away.
Okay, so you have the moral argument and the political machine. But it still feels like something is missing, something that could actually hurt the wallets of the elite.
Yes, that's the third front. The economic reality was changing. The Industrial Revolution was shifting power away from agriculture, away from the sugar islands, and towards manufacturing.
So the plantation economy wasn't the only game in town anymore.
Precisely. And on top of that, you have some economists making the very cold argument that free labor was actually more efficient.
More profitable.
More profitable. It sounds cynical, but it made a certain kind of sense. A wage worker has an incentive to be productive. Plus, with free labor, the employer isn't responsible for housing, food, or, crucially, policing the workforce.
All those costs are outsourced to the worker.
Yep. So the economic model of slavery itself was starting to look fragile, and every time there was a rebellion in the Caribbean, it looked even more costly and unsustainable.
Which brings us to what might be the single biggest catalyst, the resistance of the enslaved people themselves.
This is the factor that forced their hand. There's no doubt about it. The Baptist War in Jamaica, also called the Christmas Rebellion of 1831, proved the system could not hold.
Tell us about Sam Sharpe. He's such a pivotal figure.
He was a Baptist deacon, a reader, a leader. He planned what was meant to be a peaceful general strike, a mass refusal to work after Christmas unless they were paid wages.
But it didn't stay peaceful.
No, it escalated into a full-blown revolt. We're talking about 60,000 enslaved people rising up, burning plantations, demanding freedom.
And the response was, I imagine, just merciless.
Brutal. It was crushed. Hundreds were killed in the fighting and the reprisals. And Sam Sharpe himself was executed.
But his actions sent a shockwave all the way to London.
A massive one, because it proved two things to Parliament. One, the military cost of holding on to slavery was getting out of control. And two, if they didn't legislate abolition from above, a much bigger, bloodier revolution from below was inevitable.
So fear became the great motivator.
The fear of another Haiti. It convinced the British elite that abolition, even with that huge compensation payout, was the safer and ultimately cheaper option.
It's an incredible mix of forces, the moral pressure, the economic shift, and then just the raw terror of rebellion.
Exactly.
But even with all of that, the opposition was, as you said, highly organized and incredibly powerful.
Oh, yes. The idea that British prosperity depended on slave-produced sugar was deeply, deeply ingrained. This wasn't just an economic debate. It was a political war.
Aged by the West India lobby.
A truly formidable machine. This was a well-funded group of planters, merchants, bankers. They had seats in Parliament. They had incredible influence.
Who was a key figure there?
Someone like George Hibbert, a major London merchant who argued over and over that ending slavery wouldn't just ruin the Caribbean, it would literally crash Britain's entire economy.
And their arguments were backed up by this really insidious racist ideology.
To justify the cruelty, you needed a theory. And that was provided by men like Edward Long, a planter and so-called historian in Jamaica. His writings promoted the disgusting and baseless idea that Black people were inherently inferior.
It was the intellectual ammunition they needed.
It was. It allowed them to dismiss the moral arguments of abolitionists for decades.
So when they realized they couldn't stop abolition entirely, they changed tactics.
They pivoted from outright prevention to damage control. And their new strategy was one word: gradualism.
The idea that the enslaved weren't ready for freedom.
Exactly. It was a brilliant tactic because it sounded reasonable and it took all the urgency out of the moral argument. And the man pushing this hardest was John Gladstone.
John Gladstone. A name many will know, but maybe not in this context. A huge plantation owner.
One of the biggest. He fought tooth and nail for a gradual transition. He wanted to maintain control over the labor force, and he wanted to make sure he got paid. The apprenticeship system was essentially his victory.
And his actions after 1833 really show his true motive, don't they?
They do. As soon as abolition was a done deal, he immediately started looking for new sources of cheap labor. He was one of the first to start importing indentured workers from India and China under new, incredibly exploitative contracts.
So in the end, the opposition lost the main battle over legal abolition, But they won two massive concessions.
The 20 million pounds in compensation and the apprenticeship system to guarantee a few more years of free labor. They lost the law, but they kept their economic power.
So the apprenticeship system begins in 1834, and for the next 4 years, this becomes the new front line in the fight.
It does. The abolitionists felt completely betrayed by this compromise. They saw it for what it was, slavery by another name, and they immediately started campaigning to end it.
And this is where public opinion becomes absolutely critical again.
Right, and we have to talk about the work of a Quaker abolitionist named Joseph Sturge.
Okay.
He wasn't content to just read the official reports from the colonies. In 1837, he sailed to Jamaica to investigate the system for himself on the ground.
And what did he find?
He found a horror show. He meticulously documented everything, the continued use of the whip, the manipulation of the courts, the brutal working conditions. He proved that apprenticeship was not preparing anyone for freedom. It was just prolonging the cruelty.
And he brought that evidence back to Britain.
He did. And when the British public saw his reports, the raw testimony, there was just this massive wave of moral outrage. They saw they'd been sold a lie.
The pressure must have been immense.
So intense that Parliament had to act. They were forced to end the apprenticeship system early in 1838, 2 years ahead of schedule for the field hands. It was a huge win for that continued activism.
And it's worth mentioning that there were a few officials on the right side of this, even in the colonies.
There were, like Governor Peter Brown, the Marquis of Sligo in Jamaica. He was there from 1834 to 36, and he actively fought the planters and supported the transition to freedom.
And that's where Sligoville comes from, right?
Yes. Jamaica's first free village was named in his honor. And these villages were so important. They were a physical rejection of the plantation system, a place to build a future.
Which brings us to the legacy of it all. Because the end of legal slavery in 1838, it's a triumph, but it's not the end of the story.
Not even close. The formerly enslaved now faced this huge struggle just to own land. The planters controlled everything and refused to sell the best plots.
So the free villages became the only real path to economic independence.
They were. But the planters just adapted their model. They turned to indentured labor from India and China, creating a new system of exploitation to feed the same old hunger for cheap labor.
And the economic inequality, the land disputes, all of it, starting from the compromises of 1833, you could still see the echoes of that in Jamaica today.
Absolutely. It's a wound that never really healed because the foundation of a truly free society was never properly laid.
So when you pull it all together, the sources show that the end of slavery was as much an act of political pragmatism as it was a moral victory.
It was. It was driven by real moral outrage, yes. But that outrage only succeeded when it was combined with cold economic logic and the very real, very terrifying threat of rebellion from men like Sam Sharpe.
And that really gives us our final takeaway, doesn't it? We rightly celebrate figures like Wilberforce, Buxton, and especially Sam Sharpe. But the historical record is crystal clear about who paid the price for freedom. It was the formerly enslaved people. They paid with 4 more years of brutal, unpaid labor, and they were given absolutely nothing to start their new lives. Meanwhile, the oppressors walked away 20 million pounds richer.
Which leaves you with a final thought to consider long after this deep dive ends. If the wealth generated by generations of enslaved labor was used to the tune of 40% of the national budget to compensate the oppressors rather than to empower the oppressed with land and capital, how much of today's global economic inequality, the gap between the West and the former colonies, how much of that is directly traceable to the so-called emancipation deals made back then? It makes you question the very foundation of so much of that historic wealth.